Professor Scott Denning is actually he's a Montfort professor of atmospheric science at Colorado State University. He also serves as Director of Education and Diversity for CMAP, the Center for Multi-Scale Modeling of Atmospheric Processes, working to enhance an understanding of global climate through K-12 undergraduate and graduate study. He is author of about 100 publications in peer-reviewed climate literature. Uh, he's a former editor of the Journal of Climate and served for 5 years as founding science chair of the North American Carbon Program. He has served on advisory panels for NASA, NOAA, and the National Science Foundation. Denning leads a group of graduate students and scientists using many kinds of observations and models to understand the metabolism of the Earth's biosphere. The key contribution of their work is the identification and prediction of sources and sinks of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere using new satellite measurements. In addition to using global satellite imagery, his research has included extensive field work in the great northwoods of Wisconsin, the farms of Iowa, the Oklahoma prairie, the African savanna, and the Amazon rainforest. With an undergraduate degree in geology, Denning pursued a brief career in the oil industry and studied high mountain ecosystems before earning a PhD in atmospheric science from Colorado State University in 1994. Denning takes special delight in discussing the subject of climate change with hostile audiences and has twice been a featured speaker at the Heartland Institute's annual conference. And above all, Scott is a great scientist, a great speaker, and a pioneer in carbon cycle research. And I consider myself very fortunate and privileged to have worked with him for more than 4 years as a research scientist in his group at Colorado State University. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Scott Denning to deliver his speech. And Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erandathie. And I would like to talk with you today about carbon. In fact, the question is, where has all the carbon gone? We know where it comes from. The extra CO2 in the atmosphere comes from burning coal, oil, and gas. But it turns out that a lot of it is going away. And so I'm here to talk with you this morning, this afternoon, this evening, whatever time zone you're in, about where has all the carbon gone. So carbon is central to life, to all of organic chemistry on Earth. Carbon is special because it has 4 valence electrons and therefore can form 4 bonds. The geometry of organic molecules is incredible, incredibly diverse. It forms chains, it forms sheets, it forms rings, it forms tubes. It can make all of these different 3-dimensional shapes and structures, and therefore it is incredibly important to the chemistry of the Earth. Photosynthesis, as you probably are well aware, is the almost magical process by which inorganic air, CO2 from the air, is converted to living biomass. The CO2 diffuses through the tiny pores in the undersides of leaves, dissolves into the water in the intercellular fluid in the leaf, and then diffuses into the cells where it finds its way into chloroplasts, and then in the presence of sunlight, poof, it's alive. Literally goes from being inorganic gas to living goo, living protoplasm. And of course, in doing this, it stores the energy of the sun. You take all of these little CO2 molecules, and photosynthesis removes the carbon and strings the carbon atoms together like beads on a string in these organic molecules. And of course, the string is actually the bonds, the carbon to carbon bonds within the sugars, ultimately within all these other biomolecules, and the bonds contain the energy of the sun. This is the sort of way that the biosphere battery is charged, and virtually all of this energy is then released back through respiration, decomposition, mostly microbial respiration, back to CO2 after the plants die and are decomposed or eaten. So this very, very fundamental process at the base of the food chain actually converts 1/7 of all the CO2 in the atmosphere every year into biomass. And then, of course, in 7 years, that would destroy the world, right? That would be the end of all the CO2. But 1/7 of all the CO2 in the atmosphere is created every year through decomposition and respiration. So this very, very large two-way exchange back and forth between the atmosphere and the biosphere with about a 7-year turnover time. In another way, you can look at this as an electrical circuit. So just as a battery has a positive end and a negative end, a cathode and an anode, so you hook up the battery to a wire and then maybe to a light bulb, and electrons flow out of the anode and through the wire, run through the light bulb, and then back into the cathode, and so you have this electrical circuit. Similarly, we can think of the entire biosphere this way, that photosynthesis is a source of electrons. Of course, they are produced photovoltaically, really quite literally down at the molecular level. There's a photovoltaic cell, which is the chloroplasts in photosynthesis that produce free electrons that pass through the entire biosphere, which is sort of the light bulb analogy here, and then back via respiration, decomposition, reaction with oxygen to recharge and be ready for the next time through. So I want to talk a little bit about a little leakage from our global circuit. Some of the energy from the solar energy from photosynthesis that is stored in biomass can be fossilized at the bottom of the ocean or in the bottom of a lake or something like that. You can imagine a little bit of the biomass that's created by photosynthesis does not get decomposed back to CO2, but instead gets buried. And if the burial is quick enough in the sediments, then the biomass is taken out of circulation. The bacteria can't get to it. It can't be decomposed quickly enough, and it can be preserved in fossilized remains. And then if that preservation lasts a long time, if you bury the stuff deeply enough so that it's about 100 degrees Celsius for about 1 million years or so, there's a very, very slow geologic conversion of that fossil biomass into petroleum, into oil and gas. And just as if you're cooking and you have some cooking oil, that oil will float in the fluids in the rocks. And then, of course, people go out and drill for the oil, and this is what we use. Largely, 80% of the energy in today's global economy comes from this source. So it's actually fossilized biomass that has stored solar energy for hundreds of millions of years, and is then brought up to the surface for combustion. So here is an example of a hydrocarbon that is recovered from this process. You can count the carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is octane. It's a hydrocarbon molecule that's used in fuels. And of course, the energy in the bonds here is fossilized solar energy from a long, long time ago, geologic time. We set this stuff on fire, for example, in automobiles or in factories, and every atom in the hydrocarbon reacts with oxygen, and then all of this energy that was stored in the bonds comes out as free energy that we use to run our machinery or manufacturing and so forth. So this is the story of energy from fossil fuels. As long as 200 years ago, about 1824. Joseph Fourier in France discovered that the atmosphere had special properties of passing different kinds of wavelengths of radiation, and that this was enough to warm the Earth's climate over time. And he coined this idea of the greenhouse effect. A generation later, a woman in the eastern United States published some experiments regarding the absorption of solar energy by different gases, and she identified CO2 as the primary gas that was associated with the greenhouse effect. So this is a very long time ago. There were quantitative experiments in the following decade by John Tyndall and others that measured the absorption of CO2 of infrared radiation in different concentrations. And then by the 1890s, Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius showed that doubling CO2 would warm the global average temperature by about 3 degrees. And so this was sort of the birth of the IPCC, the global warming that we are aware of now. But it's not something we discovered in the 21st century. This is sort of 19th century discoveries. In the 1930s, the British scientist Guy Callendar made low precision measurements all over the world and was the first to sort of suggest that CO2 was actually rising and it wasn't going to just dissolve into the oceans. It was actually accumulating in the atmosphere. But the real precise measurements of CO2 had to await the invention of a infrared gas analyzer by David Keeling in the 1950s, and he set up long-term measurements, continuous measurements of CO2 in Hawaii at the top of a very tall mountain in 1959, the day I was born, or year I was born, and almost immediately, by 1960, had already discovered that CO2 was rising and that there was this big seasonal cycle that has to do with the uptake of CO2 by the plants in the northern hemisphere and then the release of CO2 through decomposition in the winter. And because he could account for the total rate of increase of CO2, he was able to show even as early as 1960 that not all of the fossil fuel CO2 wound up in the atmosphere. Some of it was missing. About half of the CO2 from fossil fuel does not add to the CO2 in the atmosphere. And so there was this question about where is the other half going? At first, everybody thought it was going into the oceans. But when I was a little boy, when I was about 5 years old, the US and the Soviet Union did a terrible thing. They blew off a lot of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere to test them. And in fact, in 1963, the US and the Soviet Union signed a nuclear test ban treaty that prohibited any future nuclear bomb testing. But before that went into effect, in 1964, they tested dozens and dozens of bombs in the atmosphere because they knew they would never be allowed to do it again. So there was this huge pulse of radioactive CO2, the radiocarbon CO2, C14O2. The CO2 that was made radioactive by the nuclear testing in 1964 has the same chemistry and biology as other CO2, but because it had this radiocarbon signature, it's like somebody stamped each molecule with a little label that said it was made in 1964. And oceanographers were able to go out and find the penetration of the radiocarbon CO2 from the bomb tests in the deep oceans, and thereby actually measure the rate at which CO2 from the atmosphere can penetrate into the oceans. By doing that, they were able to show quite convincingly in the 1970s that only half of the missing carbon from fossil fuel is in the oceans, and therefore the other half has to be going somewhere else. Well, if you think about the whole Earth, there's the atmosphere and there's the oceans. What else is there? There's the land. So it was really oceanographers and atmospheric scientists who proved in the 1970s that the land had to be taking up CO2. Basically, it's just arithmetic. If you take commercial records and add up all the fossil fuel burning, call that 100%. The rate of atmospheric increase by direct measurement is only 50% of that fossil fuel burning. The oceans, based on the bomb C14 data, were taking up about 25% of the fossil fuel, and that meant there was a missing sink, some sort of process that was removing another 25% of the fossil fuel CO2. So really it kind of had to be on the land. The oceanographers proposed that the land was taking up CO2 simply because plants eat CO2 for a living through photosynthesis. And the idea is that adding CO2 to the air makes them fat, right? So adding CO2 is like giving cookies to children, or for that matter, if you put a whole bunch of cookies in my kitchen, I will add biomass over time. So we sort of think of this as the cookie theory or the donut theory of CO2 sinks. The idea that adding CO2 to the atmosphere makes the plants grow faster, and it actually works in a greenhouse. If you take this is an example with rice. Grown in greenhouses at different levels of CO2. And sure enough, as you turn up the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the rice grows more and more vigorously, and you get more and more rice. But that doesn't actually explain the missing carbon, because actually everything dies, right? Not just you and me and our animals, but plants die. So even if plants are growing more, because those plants then die and are returned to the atmosphere through decomposition and respiration, there's actually a remarkable, profound truth about the CO2, which is that there has to be more plant growth than there is plant death and decomposition. So really quite an amazing thing. And when we look at the history of the Earth, or even just the history of since the last 1,000 years, we see that before the Industrial Revolution, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere was very, very steady. So growth over the long term has to balance death, right? The rate at which things grow and the rate at which they die are balanced over geologic time. That kind of have to be, otherwise the entire Earth would be consumed by, algae or something. Or on the other hand, everything would be dead. So life and death achieve some kind of balance over time. But remarkably, since the Industrial Revolution, there has been a carbon sink on land. So we can just use more plain language to say that taken over the entire planet, plants are growing faster than they're dying. This is a really quite surprising conclusion, and it was resisted. Biologists and ecologists in the 1970s really didn't want to believe the oceanographers that plants are growing faster than they're dying. In fact, they thought that plants were dying faster than they're growing, right? Through tropical deforestation, clearing of land for agriculture, biomass burning, all these different kinds of human activities. Everybody thought, until maybe the 1980s, that plants were dying faster than they were growing, that the total amount of biomass on Earth was shrinking. But it turns out that based on the measurements in the atmosphere and the measurements in the ocean, the opposite is true. It's actually a wonderful thing that about 25% of fossil fuel combustion is removed from the atmosphere through an imbalance between the rate of growth and the rate of death. Now, how is this possible? What about tropical deforestation? What about croplands and so forth? How can it possibly be that, given all of this destruction that we see, the total amount of plant material in the world is increasing over time? Part of that is the CO2 fertilization effect. So the idea is that since the Industrial Revolution, the total amount of plant growth has increased. And then, of course, after some period of time, there is an increase in decomposition. And the delay between growth increases and decomposition increases is proportional to the average turnover time of organic matter in the biosphere. So taken over the whole world, some of it is very short-lived, like a grass, and some of it is very long-lived, like certain trees. But the average is maybe 20 years between the time that carbon is taken up by photosynthesis and the time that it is released through decomposition. And that means that in a given year, there's a net imbalance, a net excess of growth over decay. And this is probably part of the net imbalance between photosynthesis and decomposition. So the CO2 fertilization effect. However, when people have tried in the field to measure this effect, so these are a set very ambitious experiment. There are maybe about 100 of these experiments. It's called free air carbon enrichment. So it's not a greenhouse. It's actually enriching CO2 outdoors in experimental plots. You put a ring of little emitters out in the forest or in the croplands or grasslands or whatever, and fumigate the inside of that ring. So there has to be a sensor in the center of the ring and valves that put more CO2 on the upwind side, and depending on the wind speed and all that, to maintain a higher level of CO2 inside the ring, and different levels in different rings. When they've done these experiments, what you typically find is that you get a growth burst. So there's faster growth in the elevated CO2 ring than the ambient ring, but that over time, this difference decreases. Essentially, there's acclimatization after maybe 5 or 10 years, and you no longer have enhanced growth in the high CO2 treatment. And the reason is because they're lacking nitrogen. There has to grow more biomass. It's not enough to just have extra CO2. You also have to have extra nitrogen, phosphorus, and so forth. So to test this hypothesis, these authors then took when the extra growth went away, they added some nitrogen fertilizer, and then you get this wood increment again. So there's a stoichiometric requirement that enhanced growth requires not just extra CO2, but also extra nitrogen. Now, it turns out, of course, that human beings are not only producing extra CO2, but we are also fixing extra nitrogen. So atmospheric nitrogen is triply bound, and it's biologically inert. You can't grow plants on air because that nitrogen is not fixed. It's not biologically available. It's not chemically active nitrogen. It's inert. In the natural world, before about 1900, nitrogen fixation was almost entirely done by lightning and by very specialized microbes that could fix nitrogen in soils, and the nitrogen was recycled constantly. So decomposing organic matter would release mineral nitrogen back into the soil, which could then be taken up by plants. But around 1910, Haber and Bosch developed this chemical fertilizer that uses energy to fix nitrogen from the air. And not only do we make a lot of fixed nitrogen for agriculture, but we also inadvertently fix a lot of nitrogen through combustion. So high temperature combustion, for example, in industry, or high pressure combustion, for example, in the cylinders of your car, actually burns a little bit of air. So you have N2 and O2, and those react to make nitrogen oxides, which then further oxidize in the atmosphere to make nitrate that falls down out of the sky as a kind of fertilizer on the biosphere. So we provide the plants of the world with extra carbon, and we also provide them with extra nitrogen, which is actually a sort of global chemical fertilizer effect. We can map this. Generally, it's in the downwind of big industry. You see these kind of nitrogen uptake plumes that go downwind into the forests. The other thing that's happening is that although large parts of the tropics are being actively deforested, so particularly in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Africa, in certain parts of South America. On the other hand, in the developed world, we see actually regrowth of forests. So if you look at the northeastern United States or Western Europe, there are many places that used to be family farms in the early 20th century, but those farms were abandoned when agriculture moved to sort of centralized big agriculture. In the US, it would be in Iowa. And then these small family farms were allowed to regrow. And so all of the wood in the trees in places like Vermont or northern Germany used to be atmospheric CO2. And rebuilding, regrowing those forests in abandoned farmland has removed CO2 from the atmosphere. So this changing land use can also be a sink, a carbon sink. Lastly, I want to talk about the increase in biomass in the far north. So the Arctic is warming more than twice as fast. It's actually almost 3 times as fast as the world as a whole. And as a result, many places way up north, up in the boreal forest and the tundra, have 50% more growing season than they did 50 years ago. So half again more frost-free days, and therefore with the longer growing seasons, you can grow shrubs where it used to only be tundra. You can grow trees where it used to only be shrubs. And this northern tree line is progressing northward. Satellite data show us over 40 years the greening of the far north. And this is also sucking up CO2. So there are all these different mechanisms. I want to sort of reiterate the 4 different mechanisms I discussed here: CO2 fertilization, nitrogen fertilization, the regrowth of forests on abandoned farmland, and then the longer growing seasons due to boreal warming. The oceans are also taking up some CO2, as the oceanographers discovered back in the 70s. So basically, the process in the ocean is the exact same chemistry as carbonated water. So if you have soda water or beer, you'll have experienced carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is CO2 dissolved in water, and it is twice as soluble in cold water as it is in warm water. This is why your beer goes flat when you leave it out on the kitchen table. The water warms up and the CO2 comes out of solution. And for this exact same chemical reason, cold polar ocean water soaks up CO2, takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. Warm tropical oceans release it. Pre-industrial times, the CO2 would dissolve in the Arctic, be transported to the tropics, and then degas. But now, of course, there's extra CO2 in the atmosphere, so there's a net transfer down into the ocean. The oceans are dark and very deep. When we go snorkeling or swimming, we can see beautiful colored fish and corals and so forth down to maybe 5 meters, 10 meters. But as you go down, if you've ever been scuba diving, you go down below about 20 meters, and everything becomes progressively dimmer and only shades of blue. 13,000 feet deep, so 4,000 meters deep, and almost that entire volume is completely pitch black and very, very cold. Even in Sri Lanka, if you were to go down, 1,000 meters down in the water, it is 3 degrees Celsius down there. Almost the entire mass of the oceans is very, very cold. You can think of this as cold water is formed at the poles. This is supposed to be representative of the global ocean. So here's the South Pole, and here's the North Pole, and here's the equator. And the surface water, of course, in the tropics is quite warm, warmed by the sun, and that water is buoyant. It floats at the top like a raft. It is negatively buoyant. It is buoyant, and it floats at the top. The only way to get the water to the bottom is to make it very, very cold. That happens in the North Atlantic, and it happens in the Antarctic, and that water flows to the bottom of the ocean and fills the entire ocean from the bottom up. It takes about 1,000 years to create enough cold water at the poles to fill the oceans and displace that water at the surface. And so the oceans are essentially sealed off from the atmosphere, and this huge volume, more than 90% of the ocean, has not touched the atmosphere since before the Industrial Revolution. It's cold, it's inky black, and it doesn't know we're here yet. There's no anthropogenic gases dissolved in the intermediate or deep water in the ocean. It's only in the surface water. Now, people have measured this. Believe it or not, thousands and thousands of samples, maybe millions of samples, have been taken of the deep ocean throughout the entire oceans by oceanographers making these depth soundings and bringing the water to laboratories. every one of these little dots, they flow together so it looks like lines. You can see a ship went from Sri Lanka back in the 1990s and made these measurements all the way to Australia. The measurements show that the anthropogenic CO2 is confined to these shallow layers near the very surface of the ocean. So this is depth down to 6,000 meters in the different ocean basins, latitude shown here. Here's the Indian Ocean. In the subtropics, there's a little more penetration, but most of the water, the huge majority of the ocean water has no anthropogenic CO2 dissolved in it, and the fossil CO2 remains trapped near the surface by buoyancy. Basically, we are performing a planetary titration of carbonic acid into the deep oceans, and it's going to take thousands of years for this to take place. So there's an overall carbon cycle where the fossil fuels are released into the atmosphere. Oops, sorry. The fossil fuels are released into the atmosphere. Some of them exchange with land, some of them exchange with ocean, and the atmosphere gets the residual. So I wanted to say in the oceans, there's both solubility. The CO2 is very soluble in cold water, but the physical mixing of that cold water down to the deep ocean is very, very slow. It takes 1,000 years to get that water down. There's also organic biological debris that is produced by the food chain, by algae taking up CO2 at the surface, and then it's eaten by zooplankton, which are eaten by fish and so forth. And eventually some of this, maybe about 10% of it, eventually sinks down out of the surface water into the deep ocean. So this is transporting CO2 into the oceans. And then on the land, the four mechanisms we discussed were CO2 fertilization. The plants are eating CO2, and you give them more CO2, they eat more. There's also nutrient fertilization, primarily by the deposition of anthropogenic nitrogen. Land use change, we think about deforestation, but also there's reforestation, particularly in the developed world, with regrowing forests on abandoned agricultural land. And then also the response to the changing climates. The boreal warming has made the growing season longer in the far north, and that allows carbon to be stored. But these sinks are filling up. So as you fill up the sinks, eventually you're going to have excess CO2 that has to come out. The land sinks are very vulnerable, very uncertain. CO2 fertilization probably continues because we have lots of extra CO2. But if you think about nitrogen deposition, a little bit of fertilizer might make plants grow faster. But if you continue to dump more and more nitrogen on them, they don't take it up. In fact, it becomes harmful if you over-fertilize the biosphere. And so you can actually reverse that sink. Regrowing forests are taking up carbon until they're mature, right? They're only growing faster than they're dying until you have a mature forest. And once the forest is at sort of its peak biomass, then it's dying as fast as it's growing again. So these are transients that don't last more than a few decades. Boreal warming is actually maybe the most dangerous one because a little bit of warming in the far north makes shrubs grow in the tundra, but a lot of warming may actually thaw the permafrost and switch the high northern latitudes from a big sink to a big source. So we kind of worry about these land sinks. The ocean sink is probably safe in the near term because the oceans are so big and it's limited by this very, very slow physical mixing into the deep ocean against the buoyancy. But as we warm the world, the surface water warms up. And so the buoyancy gets stronger and the mixing slows down, and it takes a long, long time to get the CO2 from the atmosphere into the deep ocean. Finally, once you really have mixed the oceans, then there's a limit to the amount of CO2 you can dissolve into the oceans because of acidification. As you acidify the oceans of the world with carbonic acid, the solubility of the CO2 actually decreases. So depending on the total amount of fossil fuel that's ever burned over all of history, we will eventually reach a limit to how much the oceans can take up from the atmosphere. If you think of the entire atmosphere as a big bathtub and the entire world economy as a a faucet that's dumping CO2 into the atmospheric bathtub. There are 850 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere currently, uh, which is the atmospheric CO2. Out of this 10 billion tons of fossil fuel burning every year, the oceans and the land are like leaks or drains in the bottom of the bathtub. So 5 of these billion tons go out of the tub, and 5 billion tons are added, and the level of CO2 in the atmosphere rises. So unfortunately, we think about emissions reductions, but emissions reduction is just changing the rate of change of the water in the tub, right? The climate forcing, the warming, comes from the water that's in the tub. So really, the fossil fuel burning has to approach zero in order for the water to go down. And the drains are not connected to very large reservoirs. The plants and soils are rather limited compared to the size of the oceans. The amount of carbon in the plants and soils is quite small. So currently we're putting a lot of carbon into plants and soils out of our atmospheric bathtub. The deep ocean has a much larger capacity, but it's just drip, drip, drip into the deep ocean because of this very slow overturning that's limited by buoyancy. The real big reservoir for carbon, of course, is in the sediments and the rocks. That's where we took it from. But unfortunately, that takes geologic time to refill that reservoir. So I hate to show you this, but it's true that here is a graph that, unlike most graphs, this graph goes out not just till 2100, but here is the year 5000 AD, the year 10,000, all the way out to the year 40,000 AD. Very, very long picture of the fraction of the total amount of fossil fuel that remains in the atmosphere. And you see we're close to half now. And then what we imagine is that over the next, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, humanity will stop burning fossil fuels and we will switch to other kinds of energy. It will take thousands of years for that CO2 to react with the deep ocean. So this is ocean invasion of the fossil CO2, and that maybe goes out to the year 3000 or even the year 4000. At that point, then you have solubility reactions in the deep ocean that have to dissolve calcium carbonate, which is limestone, sedimentary rock. And that takes another, say 20,000 years to remove that next fraction. And finally, you're left with a fraction, perhaps 10% of the fossil fuel that has to react with igneous rocks on land. So this is the really, really slow part. That will take on the order of 50,000 years to react that all the way. So it's a very, very long tail at the end of this this process of equilibrating carbon with the Earth system. So something like 10% remains after 40,000 years. If we burn enough carbon, it's perhaps as much as 40% of the fossil fuels CO2 that remains in the atmosphere. So I'm going to summarize now. CO2 cycles very vigorously between the air, the land, and the oceans. There's this biological cycle. There's this solubility cycle with the oceans. There's a big release of fossil fuel, and the whole thing is churning and churning all the time. Growth and decay of biomass is almost perfectly balanced over geologic time. We know that because the CO2 was very, very steady for thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution. But we are mining the tiny residual between life and death that accumulated over hundreds of millions of years as fossil fuel and injecting that in the air at a big pulse that only takes a couple of hundred years to deliver 100 million years worth of photosynthate. The land and the ocean are currently taking about 50% of that fossil fuel CO2 and converting it into dissolved CO2 in the oceans and into biomass on land. That carbon uptake will saturate over time. At some point, the fossil fuel CO2 will wind up in the air rather than in the ocean and the land. Hopefully by that time we will have completely converted the world economy off of fossil fuel. And unfortunately, some of that fossil fuel, maybe quite a lot of it, will stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of centuries after the fossil fuel era is finished. So that is my presentation, and I would be delighted to take your questions. Maybe somebody can help me to moderate your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That's awesome, and it's quite a different angle of the story that we heard. I'm coming from evolutionary biology and angle, so it's very refreshing and very interesting. Thank you very much. I'm pretty sure we have over 100 odd participants right now. So in
Wow.
Friday evening. So that much interest.
Well, I thank you very much for taking time out of your Friday evening to spend with me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you so much. So what we'll do, we can entertain questions. You can identify yourself and ask questions, and also you can use the chat box. Myself and Erandathie, we can together we can help Professor Denning to will channel the questions, but feel free to ask questions directly from Scott, and
Yes.
also use the chat box if you feel like that is the easier way. The podium is over to you. Professor Denning, I'll have a question. Yeah, I'm not as I mentioned, I'm not an environment scientist, but I'm a conservationist and a bit of an activist, as well as an evolutionary biologist. So we were we were told a lot about the plankton in the oceans, and the oceans are the last frontier of this battle in the climate change scenarios. So the warming and increasing kinetic energy, as well as the terrestrial like big players like the boreal forest of the northern Canada and the Russian forest, and then the Amazon, Congo, and the Bornean rainforest are kind of thinning out, and the Atlantic and Indian Oceans getting clogged with plastic. So can you please tell us, these short-term, you showed us very clearly the long-term the implications and the slowness of the process. So how that plays out in the shorter term?
Yeah, great question. Let me first address when you consider phytoplankton in the oceans and also forests. I mean, your question is very comprehensive. There are, of course, there's huge productivity, but biological productivity in the oceans. But the residence time of carbon in phytoplankton is about 1 day, 24 hours. Versus the residence time of carbon in a boreal forest is maybe 200 years. So the same amount of productivity on land produces much more biomass than it does in the ocean. The ocean's turnover is so quick because it's mostly single-celled organisms that have very short lifespan. So the ocean biological story is essentially a very small storage pool with very large inputs and outputs that turns over. Whereas on the land, if you increase the photosynthesis even by a small amount, you have a delay of perhaps a century between the time you put the extra photosynthate in and the time it comes back out. So this is quite different. The ocean uptake of CO2 is dominated really by chemistry more than biology. You dissolve CO2 in water, but there it's the reservoir that's dissolving the CO2. The part of the ocean that is in physical contact with the atmosphere is very small, maybe 200 meters at the most, because of buoyancy, because the surface water just floats on top like a raft. So the limiting factor is really this physical mixing against buoyancy, and that mostly happens at the poles. You have to make imagine what it's like in Antarctica right now, right? It's very dark, it's very, very cold, and that water gets so cold that it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. It carries dissolved CO2 with it, but that's only a very small part of the ocean that's subject to those conditions. So the short term, probably, let's say over the next 30 years, people have to stop burning coal, oil, and gas. I mean, it really comes down to the production and combustion of fossil fuel is dramatically raising the CO2 of the atmosphere, and the sinks are helping. They're buying us time. They're giving us 20 or 30 year window that we have to replace the energy from fossil fuel with other kinds of energy in our global economy. The sinks have persisted since 1960 when they first invented good instruments. It's amazing. The sinks have continued to grow to take about 50% of fossil fuel emissions over this entire period. A lot of people back in the 1970s and 80s, famous scientists thought, no, this is all gonna go away, this sink. But it's persisted. So we're very lucky that the land and the oceans have bought us time like this. And there's some concern that as we stop putting CO2 in to the atmosphere, then the gradient reverses, right? So you've put all this extra CO2 now into the surface ocean and the plants. If you start drawing down CO2, it will come back out. So there's nobody really knows what happens there, but that's a huge issue maybe for the next generation of your students as they study this. What happens to the industrial carbon that has been sequestered in the plants and in the oceans over the last 100 years? When we particularly if we try to do things like CO2 removal, this may fight us. So actually fascinating question, and the answer to this question will be one of the big science questions for the next generation of scientists. I won't be here, I will be retired, but somebody else can work on that.
What would the course say, historic, the past 50 to 250 million year, old course would tell us? In the cycle, would they tell us what would happen if we reduce the number of amount of carbon emitting into the atmosphere? Because the cycles had happened before, right?
Right. Well, so there's different timescales there. Of course, we're concerned about what happens in 30 years. The glacial and interglacial cycles of CO2. So this is like 100,000 year cycle, not 100 year, not 100 million years, but 100,000 years. That is mostly about changes in the productivity of the ocean biosphere. During ice ages, there's a lot of dust that blows out over the ocean, and that fertilizes the algae. But it takes like 100,000 years for that to draw down CO2.
Yeah,
so if we have to wait 100,000 years, that's a pretty long time for you and me. Yeah. Over geologic time, really the millions of years time scale, the story is different. Then it's really about, it comes from plate tectonics. It comes from volcanoes. It comes from ocean, mid-ocean ridge volcanism is the source of CO2. And the sink of CO2 on those time scales is chemical weathering of igneous rocks. So when mountains come up, CO2 dissolves in the rainwater, and that erodes the mountains, and that removes CO2 from the atmosphere. It turns it into limestone in the oceans, and then in plate tectonics, the limestone gets subducted and melted and turned back into volcanoes. So there's this, but I mean that's like
long term.
Yeah, really long time. So we have like humans time scale of decades. We have ice age time scales of hundreds of thousands of years, and then we have plate tectonics time scales of hundreds of millions of years. Unfortunately, we have to solve this for ourselves and our children. We don't have time for ice ages to take care of it. We have to do this, in our generation.
Yeah, Professor Denning, there's a question here. Is ocean acidification real? If
Oh
so,
yeah.
what would be the impacts?
So ocean acidification is I don't have good slides for this for you, but you know how if you maybe you don't know this, if you take tap water, water from your kitchen, and you bubble CO2 through that water, you make carbonated water. And this is for example I don't know, Pellegrino. This is water that you drink with dinner that has dissolved CO2 in it. It's acidic. It cuts. This is why we like it with food, right? Because it's like wine. It tastes good with cheese. So the carbonic acid H2CO3 dissociates to make hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. That's HCO3 minus. And then the bicarbonate ion further dissociates to make another hydrogen ion and a carbonate, CO3 2 minus. The carbonate is in chemical equilibrium with seashells, with limestone. So all of the marine organisms that make their body parts out of calcium carbonate are part of this large titration, acid-base chemistry of the oceans. If you add enough CO2 to the oceans by dissolving it from the atmosphere, you consume the carbonate ion to react with the CO2 and make bicarbonate, this kind of weak acid anion. And that is terrible for the organisms that make their body parts out of calcium carbonate. They become more soluble. And it's not like they immediately dissolve, but it's more like from a, I mean, you're an evolutionary biologist, it's more like you have made the oceans undersaturated in the carbonate ion, and therefore organisms whose metabolism removes carbonate ion from the seawater need more energy to do that because they they starve. They don't have enough metabolic energy to extract this low concentration carbonate ion from the seawater. So this is kind of an overview of ocean acidification. Ocean acidification has been associated over geologic time with mass extinction events. So there are two really big bad mass extinction events in the geologic record. One, 252 million years ago, the end of the Permian. 90% of ocean species died, and it was associated with massive ocean acidification. There was a big release of CO2 perhaps from volcanoes, acidified the oceans all the way to the bottom, and mass extinction and kind of reset evolution at the end of the Permian, the end of the Paleozoic.
Yes.
Yeah, we mustn't do that. We mustn't cause massive ocean acidification. So far, it's relatively minor. So far, where you see this is in upwelling zones in the ocean. So along the west coasts of the continents where the currents bring up deep water that's very high in CO2, those waters are already becoming acidified, and other kinds of commercial fisheries that depend on seashells are threatened even now, like South Africa, Peru, Western Australia. 30, 40, 50 years from now, then we start to see it sort of globally. Setting coal on fire.
I see. Cool. Thank you. Yes, I don't have any questions in the chat box.
I see another one. Just whoa, there's a couple more now appearing.
There it is.
So it says, since there's more carbon now to get back to the balance, would we ideally need more forests and trees? So sure, this would be great. So reforestation has been proposed. And if you have a very aggressive program of planting forests, you could offset some of the CO2 from the fossil fuels. And people are certainly doing this at some scale. So the limit to how much you can do with reforestation, of course, is that the land that you want to reforest has to be able to support a forest, right? Right. So you're not going to grow a forest in Saudi Arabia, right? You're not going to grow a forest in Antarctica. There are lots of places in the world that can't support a forest because there's not enough water, not enough growing season, whatever. And uh, the places that can support forests typically already have forests, right? So we already have a forest in Siberia. We already have a forest in the Amazon. So you can't reforest that. So it really reforestation. It has to be a place that can have a forest. And the trouble is we're using that land, right? The places in the world that could be forest that aren't currently forest, most of them are farms. That's where we grow our food, right? So places that are very fertile and have lots of water, but they don't have trees. The reason they don't have trees is because we cut down the trees to grow food. So it's hard to find enough land to support massive reforestation without cutting into our food supply. And in the long run, probably this could offset some substantial amount of fossil fuel emissions, but only if we stop adding fossil fuel emissions, right? So you still have to stop burning the coal, oil, and gas. Then maybe the reforestation can get you partway back, but you have this big economic trade-off between food production and reforestation. And we don't want to stop all the food production, right? We have 7.5 billion people on Earth that have to eat. So anyway, it's kind of a huge land management issue for the next 30 or 40 years.
Scott, this is another question along the same line. I think it's basically the same question. There's a new one. Yes. Yes, you can see the last one.
So with regard to tropical forests, absolutely. Just like we have to stop burning fossil fuel, we have to stop cutting down tropical forests. And the tropical forests that have died and have been cut back, if we can reforest those, that's great. Again, the people who cut those forests down did it because they wanted to grow more food. So you have to fight, right? I don't want to fight, but somebody has to argue about this and come up with the ideal mix of land use between food production and forest. And then the next question is, how can microorganisms contribute towards carbon fixing? Different kinds of microbes do different things, but generally what microbes do is consume organic molecules, consume dead plants, dead biomass, and then produce CO2. So they don't actually fix much CO2. They turn over fast. The average lifetime of a bacterium is a matter of hours, not years. And so the microbes, for the most part, are a part of the very rapid cycling of carbon, but they're not a big storage pool of carbon. The exception to this are nitrogen fixing microbes. So there is a subset, relatively small number of microbial species that can use metabolic energy to break the nitrogen triple bond, in atmospheric nitrogen and make bio nitrogen. So that's like legumes can do this, the microbes that live on the roots of legumes. There's a whole bunch of species of algae in the ocean that can do this. So those are a special case. That's where the nitrogen is converted from the atmosphere into proteins, and that is absolutely critical to the biosphere. Okay, we got another one about global lockdown. The global lockdown had a big impact on fossil fuel, probably the biggest impact since the 1950s. The fossil fuel emissions went down in 2020 for the first time in a long time. And it went down perhaps 8% for the whole world. And now it's coming back because some developed countries have vaccinated a lot of their population and the economies are opening up. So it probably looks like a temporary dip Yeah, you know, it's substantial implications of this economically. We wouldn't want to have global lockdown forever. It's terrible, global lockdown. We hate global lockdown. So if that's what it takes to reduce fossil fuel emissions by 8%, that's that's not going to work. We're not going to be able to eliminate fossil fuels by just going home. We already did that, and it only reduced it by 8%. If you want to do the other 92%, what do you do with that? So I think it's very important that we develop alternative energy and also figure out how to use energy more efficiently, because just staying home and doing Zoom presentations is not going to be sufficient to eliminate fossil fuels. If the global lockdown did less than 10%, then forget it. We have to do something else, because I can't stand global lockdown. I don't want to do that forever. We gotta have a better way. Okay, we have another question. Given the situation, can carbon capture and storage be a viable solution? Certainly, there is carbon capture and storage. So the most efficient, I'm going to talk about three kinds. The most efficient kind of carbon capture is photosynthesis, right? So this is what we already talked about with regard to reforestation. Leveraging a billion years of evolution to use solar energy of chloroplasts and fix carbon in tree trunks. That's the best kind of carbon capture and storage. And it happens by itself, right? All we have to do is protect the land, and the trees will grow and everything is good. But the limit is land. We only have so much available land that can support forests. So the next technology that people have talked about using for this is biofuels. So you grow, instead of growing crops for eating, you grow crops for energy. For example, soy diesel. You can make fuel out of plants. Now that's not negative carbon emissions. That's only zero carbon emissions, right? Because the CO2 comes down from the atmosphere, it goes into the plants, and then you put it in your car and you burn it again as soy diesel, and it's back in the atmosphere. So there's a net zero flux. But if you can take that soy diesel, bring it to a power plant, burn it to make electricity, and then capture the CO2 emissions in the smokestack, now you have negative emissions. The CO2 went into the plants, then you captured the efflux, the CO2 effluent from the smokestack, and you have this liquid CO2. You have to do something with it. It's expensive, it's difficult, you have to gather it up. But this is potentially a negative carbon emissions technology, a CO2 removal technology that might help us out. It's expensive, very expensive, and it uses a lot of the energy that you get from the biofuel. So it's not as good as forests, but it's not terrible. And so it's feasible. Again, though, the limit is how much land do you want to convert from producing food to producing soy diesel, for example. And then the third thing, once you've used up all the forest land and all the cropland that you've decided you can dedicate to carbon removal, the last thing is direct air capture of CO2. And this is essentially just big fans that blow air through a net that is covered with a very alkaline solution that dissolves the CO2, and then you extract the CO2 from that concentrated solution. Again, you have to do something with it. The problem there is extremely energy inefficient, because when we burn carbon, we're taking reduced carbon and reacting it with oxygen in an oxidizing atmosphere. It releases energy, right? This is why we do it, because this is a source of energy for our world economy. And capturing the CO2 from the dilute atmosphere, from oxidized CO2 out of an oxidizing atmosphere, to reduce it and put it in the ground, that actually uses energy, right? So you have to get the energy somewhere to suck CO2 from the air, Where are you going to get the energy? Well, burning coal. No, that's not going to help you. So you have to have some very large source of carbon-free energy in order to extract CO2. And if you had a very large source of carbon-free energy, you would just use that to keep the lights on. You wouldn't worry about sucking CO2. So it's sort of a circular logic there. You have to have, no matter what you do, you have to get off of fossil fuel and build some sort of new energy system that can produce good lives for people that doesn't add CO2 to the atmosphere. Then you can worry about cleaning up the mess. But you can't get away from the fact that we have to stop burning the carbon to begin with. Oh my, look at all the questions now. We have great questions. So what about organic farming or being vegans? This is good. This is very good. I mean, perhaps as much as, it depends how you count, but maybe 30 or 40% of current fossil fuel emissions has some relationship to the production of food. And a big part of that has to do with animal agriculture, the production of meat. If everybody in the world were to become vegan, it would cut CO2 emissions by maybe 40%. So that's good, but you still have the other 60%, right? So we have to do everything we can, and maybe not everybody is going to become a vegan, and maybe not everybody is going to be eating organic rice. But actually, rice is not good either because there's methane associated with rice. But you know, it's a sort of there are many different ways we can work on this, and agriculture is certainly one of the big ways, but it's not as big as energy. Energy is still the big elephant in the room that is releasing so much carbon. Okay, this next question. Can we relate unusual natural disasters like floods to the increase in CO2? And what is the relationship between change of rainfall patterns and increase in CO2? Great questions. So it's complicated. The biggest picture, the planetary picture, is that the warmer the climate, the more energy there is to evaporate water from the oceans. And therefore, the more water there is in the atmosphere, so you must have more rain. So the average lifetime of water in the atmosphere is about 9 days. And so every time you increase the evaporation, you increase the rainfall. But that's only globally. At a local scale or regional scale, some places get more of that rain and other places get less of that rain. And to the almost perfect approximation, the vertical motion of the atmosphere delivers the water. So everywhere where the air goes up, it rains, and everywhere where the air comes down, it doesn't rain. And so typically, as you warm the world, you crank that machine faster, right? There's more fuel, which is the evaporation from the oceans. So we expect the tropical regions like Sri Lanka to get more rain because there's a huge reservoir of water vapor in the Indian Ocean, right? You guys have no shortage of evaporation in your region. On the other hand, in places like the Sahara or Australia, which is the down subsiding part of that circulation system, then it's drier there. So to some degree, we expect the wet places to get wetter and the dry places to get drier as the world warms up. And that is what we observe. Other kinds of catastrophic events may or may not be related to global warming, and I think there's kind of a hierarchy. We know for sure more heat and more heat waves and more social problems, health problems from heat. The next thing down, probably more precipitation in wet places like Sri Lanka. But as you get down this list, you get down to things like hurricanes and cyclones and things like that. Then it's less and less easy to associate that with CO2 and warming. So you can't say all the natural disasters are due to CO2, but some of them are. So I hope I've answered that question. That's maybe the hardest question anybody asked in this seminar.
So that's So if you have a few more minutes, Scott, we can. I think we can entertain another 1 or 2 questions.
Okay.
Excuse me, sir. Can I ask a question?
Yes, Suresha.
Yeah, Professor, first of all, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Professor, as you said, like ocean acidification will eventually have a greater impact on aquaculture ventures, like shelled organisms such as oysters, mussels, etc.
Yeah.
So, and at the moment, due to overexploitation of wild population, the world is actually looking for more and more into the aquaculture ventures. Like in case this problem became worsen and the communities do not listen to what the scientists have to say, like most of the times, then what kind of options we will have as scientists in our hands to save such aquaculture ventures? And that is my first question. I have another question. And as you said, there is a dramatic increase of carbon dioxide due to fossil fuel burning. And like we see that the world is looking for more clean energy sources. To get the idea at this very present moment, Professor, what is the like the trend in the world, or what is the current level of effort of the world in reducing this addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels? Thank you very much.
Great questions. So, with regard to what can scientists do if people don't listen to us, we sadly we can't do very much, right? We are human beings. We do the best we can. We communicate. We go and make speeches. We go on television. We have websites and so forth. But you know there are only so many scientists. There really we are a tiny minority. Now my sense is that. This has gotten so much bigger than scientists, right? There are millions of people around the world who are screaming to our governments to develop other energy sources that do not involve burning fossil fuels. So hopefully the social and economic and political dimensions of this have gone far beyond science. We do the best we can. We are honest. We are try to be as clear as we can when we communicate with the public. And ultimately, we are also citizens, and we exercise our right to vote and to speak on issues in our societies. So I don't know what else to tell you. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I will continue to do this till I die. And I'm very passionate about the communication about these issues. But sadly, you know, what we do in the world is not just up to scientists. It's up to, well, it's not. That's not sad. That's actually a wonderful thing, right? Everybody has a voice, and we all have to raise our voices. With regard to the progress that people are making about reducing fossil fuel, I think there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that the alternative kinds of energy, like hydropower, like solar and wind, and the storage of energy in batteries, and transmission of energy through new kinds of transmission lines, all of these technologies have gotten much cheaper, to the point that it's now less expensive to produce energy without fossil fuel than it is to extract and burn fossil fuel. So this will change the world. It may take a while, but certainly we've already seen in the last 10 years a dramatic improvement in the economics of clean energy. The clean energy has fallen in cost by a factor of 10 in 10 years. Absolutely incredible. Imagine if other things were 10 times less expensive than they were 10 years ago. And because this is one of the primary costs in the world economy, this will help billions of people having less expensive energy. On the downside, people are still burning a lot of fossil fuel, right? Especially there are billions of people in the world who don't have enough energy, who are energy poor. And as those billions of people come into the modern economy and build developed economies, they will need energy. And so there's kind of a race between development and the availability of clean energy. And it's really important that we accelerate the development of clean energy in order to meet this acceleration of demand. So I don't know how this is going to turn out. It's probably the biggest story in history. And we are right in the middle of it. And we get to watch probably the most exciting drama to affect the human race in a long time. I hope it turns out well. I really do.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Scott, there's a question from Punya Lienege.
What do I think about the recent temperature in Canada? Absolutely amazing. It was, I believe
49,
there was
I think 49 degrees.
49. Imagine
Yeah.
that in Canada. And that town that recorded 49, I think it's 49.6. The next day, that town burned to the ground. It's gone. It's wiped off the face of the earth. This is Canada we're talking about. It's cold in Canada, but not anymore. So this is a little bit complicated, but most of your scientists, you know about normal distribution, Gaussian distribution, bell curve, right? So if you think of temperature as a bell curve, which it sort of is, if you look at local temperature records anywhere, they follow a Gaussian distribution, normal distribution. A little bit of warming essentially shifts the bell curve to the right. Okay, so even if you don't change the statistics of the temperature, you just change the mean, you have shifted the bell curve to the right. Now the tail of that normal distribution, the very narrow part, the very improbable highest temperatures are very rare by definition, right? This is why you know how bell curves work. And if you shift the curve, the part that was really skinny out there at 50 degrees Celsius becomes bigger, right? So this is exactly what happens. And we have seen this happen everywhere. The bell curves have shifted to the right. Actually, they've gotten a little broader too, and that has to do with the dynamics of the atmosphere. But even if there were no change in the dynamics, just shifting the normal distribution to the right will dramatically increase the probability of temperatures exceeding any given threshold. So if you decide, let's say 40 degrees is too hot for you, you know, maybe you used to have 40 degrees. I don't know. In Sri Lanka, do you ever have 40 degrees?
We do sometimes, yes. Increasingly, such anomalies are
Maybe
becoming common.
1% of the time or something like that.
Yeah.
So maybe you shift this Gaussian to the right, and instead of 1% of the time, it's 10% of the time. See how that works? It doesn't take much of a shift, lateral shift in a Gaussian distribution to change the frequency, the probability of these rare events that are out at the tail of the curve. And it's exactly what's happened in Canada, is that that event that happened about a month ago in Canada probably used to be like a once in 10,000 year kind of event, and now maybe it's a once in a century event. So it's an amazing shift that happens, and it doesn't take a very large shift in the Gaussian to make those things happen. This is probably the most certain part of the impacts of global warming, because it's just about the shape of bell curves, right? There's no arguing about that. This is very straightforward statistics. You don't have to invoke some sort of complex nonlinear phenomenon. It's just the fact that as you raise the average temperature, the odds of hitting extremely high temperatures go up a lot. And it doesn't take very many Celsius to change the frequency of those terrible events out in the tail of the curve.
Scott, I heard that the same thing is happening in California now, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe not as, I mean, it's certainly hot, very, very hot. In California, in Nevada, it is in the 40s there, but it's also not as unusual in the deserts of the American Southwest to have 40 degrees. That's actually happens all the time. You know, maybe it's a little above normal, but it's not a once in 10,000 year thing like the Canada freak event.
It's ironic. It's ironic that that week more people died of the heat wave than from the pandemic. So even though after all this like hush about the pandemic,
is that true?
Yeah, apparently.
You mean in Canada?
Yeah, in British Columbia at least there were 460 something deaths.
Yeah, well, maybe more people died of the pandemic the last month or something, but I mean worldwide.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, of course.
COVID. So the real problem, I mean, if we keep this up, it's going to make the pandemic look like a picnic. I mean, we have something like 600 million people in mostly in Asia are at risk of losing their homes to flooding in case of sea level rise in this century. Oh my gosh, what do we do with 600 million refugees? It's impossible to imagine that world. We have to avoid that. We have the power to avoid that future, and we have to exert that power. We can't just put up with catastrophe like this. So I am with you. Terrible heat wave in British Columbia. Let's stop soon so that it doesn't get any worse.
Scott, one small question in relation to that. So there are theories that that the carrying capacity of the planet is kind of now coming to a limit. So if like all the world leaders, including in Sri Lankan leaders, they say that 2030 is a big year, 2035 is a big year, we are shifting to clean energy. But what if we don't stop this in, say, next 30 years on during my time? What would be the forecast would look like? I have to mention something else as well, that Sri Lanka has 65,000 square kilometers of land, but we have about 3 to 4 times more ocean that we own. We are not using anything, I think. Like a country like an island nation with like a huge ocean that we own, politically we own it. Would the solar like flotillas, or would there be some technologies of fixing carbon in the as flotillas or offshore flotillas, or at least offshore wind farms? What would be our future? What is the world's future if we don't stop? And as an island nation, what would be our future in smart?
Yeah, well, these are hard questions, and I'm not sure I have the complete answers for you, because I am just one little scientist. So, but I like your ideas. I mean, I think the forecast gets worse and worse, and we must stop before it gets that bad. I like the analogy that humanity is like a child with our hand on a hot stove, and the stove is getting hotter and hotter, and we ask, is there hope that we're going to pull our hand off? Of course there's hope. I mean, the worse it gets, so we're going to pull our hand away and go, that hurts, right? So we must stop. And the longer we leave our hand on there, the worse it's going to hurt, and the more injury we're going to do for ourselves. So it's stupid to say, we're just going to leave our hand on there forever. It doesn't matter. It's too late to move my hand. That's just crazy talk. We have to move our hands. On the issue about Sri Lanka being an island nation surrounded by a huge amount of ocean, that's wonderful, right? You have potentially all kinds of things you can do there. There's energy in the ocean. There's energy in the thermal contrast between the surface and the deep water. There's a lot of solar energy that falls on the ocean. I think, who knows what the future holds in terms of human ingenuity in the face of this huge challenge. I think back, I mean, I'm not a historian, I'm a scientist, but people have done amazing things through our long history. We've been faced with famines, we've been faced with plagues, we've been faced with terrible wars and economic collapse. In the distant past, our paleo ancestors faced ice ages and huge volcanic explosions, and yet people have been resilient and have risen to these challenges. I personally have hope that people will be smart. We will pull our hand back off that burner, and we will create new solutions, better ways to live with each other. Otherwise, how can I go on? I have to believe that people will be resilient, that my children's generation will have a better life than my generation. Otherwise, I'm a sad guy, so I try to keep a good attitude and hope for the future.
Okay, with that, I think that positive note. And for all the students listening, I think that's a great opportunity for young scientists, right? The next century, this century would be a great opportunity for the thinkers and to change this mad cycle for young people.
And
So,
Scott, sorry, Scott,
yes,
I have one. Excuse
Right.
me. I have one question actually. Our students, they have been asking you questions. Similarly, there's one professor who could not be here today, Professor Nirmali Pallewatha, and she wanted me to ask you a particular question. Actually,
Okay,
she
go
was
ahead.
there when you were the keynote speaker of that climate change conference we had in 2017.
I
And
remember.
she said there you mentioned that we did not understand some three key areas of the behavior of the atmosphere. So she wanted me to ask that.
Uh-oh. Uh, that's a tough one. So I'm not sure exactly which three things that we're talking about, but
That's yeah.
I think that we don't really understand what is happening with the carbon sinks. This is sort of the subject of my talk today too. That we don't know. We know that the carbon sinks have removed 50% of fossil fuels for the last 60 years, but it changes when the CO2 starts to go down, right? So this is really a huge question, open question in carbon cycle research is what happens to the biosphere, what happens to the ocean when the CO2 levels out or even starts to go down. So I guess I will just stay with that. But I think we should wrap up. I think we have taken people's Friday evenings. Here, I'll tell you one last thing. I am retiring here in the next few years. And I hope that when the world opens up, I can come back to Sri Lanka and visit your university in person. I had a wonderful visit in 2017, and I really hope that all of you are well, and that the pandemic is in the past, and that we can all resume our lives together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, with that note, I think Maheshi, we have a small, a small thank you note for you.
On behalf of the Ministry of Nerds, the Science Club of our Department of Zoology and Environmental Sciences, University of Colombo, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to Professor Scott Dennin for his very interesting, timely, and interactive session. I think we all gained immense knowledge about the fate of carbon and had a really nice discussion about its effect on current environmental issues. So thank you very much, Professor Scott, for that interesting presentation. And I would like also to thank Professor Erandathie Lokupitiya for hosting this event and giving us the opportunity to connect with this eminent researcher. So thank you very much, madam, for that. And further, thank you very much for Senior Professor Preeti Udagama, head of our department, for her continuous guidance and support to make this event successful. And Dr. Sampath Senaratne, he's the one who actually took the initiative to have this seminar. So thank you, sir, for your effort in making this event successful as well. So, and last, I would like to thank everyone who joined with us, especially for the people who came up with like lots of interesting questions and to make this session a very interactive and a productive one. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and goodbye. I appreciate your time.